immediately contesting the center, with the queen's pawn grants robust influence and opens avenues for rapid development. Developing a knight towards the center prepares for a flexible pawn structure and fights for key squares. Asserting central influence, c4 immediately challenges black's knight and aims to build a strong pawn presence. Embracing the dragon, black prepares to fianchetto, promising dynamic counterplay on the long diagonal. Establishing a fianchetto setup on the kingside, this move aims to control the long diagonal and prepare for castling, subtly influencing the central pawn structure. Perfectly developing the bishop, this knight's fianchetto now controls the long diagonal, preparing for central pawn breaks and a solid defensive structure. Solidifying kingside control and preparing for the castling sequence, this bishop now eyes a commanding diagonal. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, anchoring the kingside against future aggression. Developing a knight to its natural square enhances central influence and prepares for further queenside expansion, eyeing the pawn structure. Establishing a solid pawn base, black prepares to challenge white's central control and potentially open lines for queenside development. Solidifying the center and preparing for development, this move opens lines for the queen's bishop while restricting piece mobility slightly. A natural piece development, preparing to support the center and potentially challenge the kingside. Developing the knight to this square prepares to reinforce the kingside and potentially support a future f4 pawn push. Embracing the center with a pawn thrust, black seeks immediate central control and opens lines for bishop and queen. Broadening the queenside allows for a potential queenside expansion, but might leave the d4 pawn slightly less defended. Gaining space and preparing the f5 break, Ray 8 supports the central initiative. Instantly challenging black's light square diagonal opens lines and threatens initiative. Securing the rook from the bishop's diagonal pressure, this prepares to contest the open b-file, a pivotal battleground. Resecuring the king's safety with castling anchors the center and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside. Preparing to expand on the queenside, this pawn push prepares to contest the b-file and create queenside play, potentially cramping white's position. Liberating the c-pawn creates an immediate tension and opens lines for potential piece activity, forcing black to address the central pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn immediately reestablishes central equilibrium and prepares the knight for potential queenside pressure. Exploiting the open d-file now, white seeks to disrupt black's central pawn structure. Opening a diagonal for the bishop, but surrendering central control for a pawn is a questionable trade. Liberating the bishop from its pawn chain, this bishop sacrifice aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain attacking chances. By contesting the queenside advance, black aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially liberate their own cramped pieces. Exchanging queens now simplifies the position, potentially leading to advantageous endgame play by exploiting black's slightly cramped queenside. Recapturing the queen initiates a crucial endgame where controlling the open files becomes paramount for initiative. Centralizing the bishop to eye the queenside weakness and restrict black's pawn breaks offers a subtle positional advantage. Repositioning the rook to the open file offers a crucial defensive shield and prepares a sortie into the queenside. Opening the e-file with tempo aims to activate the rook and disrupt black's potentially cramped pieces. Unlocking the c8-h3 diagonal, the bishop surveys potential outpost squares and prepares to contest open files. Aggressively seizing central space, this pawn thrust aims to restrict black's knight and potentially open lines for white's pieces. Unleashing the knight to g4 aggressively challenges the f2 pawn, creating immediate tactical complications and forcing white to react. Dislodging the knight with this pawn push creates a crucial space advantage and initiates a dangerous kingside attack. Black aggressively challenges white's central control, creating an immediate pawn chain skirmish and opening lines for piece development. Liberating the bishop from its blockade, This exchange aims to clarify the central pawn structure and open diagonal lines for white's queenside pieces. Regaining the piece simplifies the position, aiming to activate the pinned knight. Unlocking the queenside pawns creates dynamic imbalances, potentially opening lines for your attack while forcing black to react. Sacrificing the bishop here exchanges a key attacking piece, potentially simplifying the position for white's rooks and opening lines towards black's king. Securing the monarch after the tactical exchange allows for centralized knight activity and prepares for the upcoming pawn advances. Reclaiming the d-pawn allows black to activate the knight, aiming for central control and preparing to contest the open files. Activating the rook to the central file signals white's intent to seize open lines and apply pressure on black's slightly compromised pawn structure. This knight repositions, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially liberate the f-pawn. Asserting control over the crucial d-file, this piece now eyes weaknesses on the queen side and prepares for an endgame advantage. Reclaiming the open files with this knight allows for a more active defense and potential counterplay in the center. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure and seize central influence. Recapturing the rook on the d-file seizes an open avenue, immediately challenging white's advanced pawns and creating counterplay. Rallying the rooks to dominate open files after the exchange offers a potent counter to black's potentially cramped position. The bishop's retreat opens a path for the knight, aiming to disrupt white's rook control and prepare a kingside counterattack. Clearing the d-file opens a path to potentially exploit black's slightly awkward knight placement. Reclaiming the central file with the rook offers counterplay and begins simplifying into an endgame where initiative is key. The rook exchange simplifies the position, offering white a clear central pawn majority and an active rook. Reclaiming the central file after the exchanges clears lines for active piece play. Forcing the king into the open with a delightful discovered attack, clearing a path for the rook to dominate the central file. A vital tempo gain, consolidating the piece advantage by driving the enemy king from its previously cozy outpost. The knight's leap forward seizes the open central file, promising an immediate threat to the exposed king. Opening the queenside allows pawns to advance, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn majority and create queenside play. Unlocking the queenside pawn majority with active knight placement. Aggressively challenging the pawn chain, this move seeks to unravel the king's position and create attacking chances. Securing the central pawn complex, this king maneuver aims to activate the monarch for the approaching endgame. Opening the g-file for your king creates immediate tactical complications. Unlocking the kingside pawn structure dramatically alters the endgame's dynamic, promising an attacking advantage. Opening a new front, this pawn push aims to disrupt white's pawn chain and create a dynamic imbalance in the center. Striking open the b-file for piece activity, white offers a dynamic pawn sacrifice for initiative. Unleashing a pawn storm to disrupt white's central control, aiming for queenside activity. Seizing the initiative, this knight jumps into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create immediate threats. Unleashing the pawn chain to break open the center for your rook's activity is a bold initiative. The knight repositions, eyeing the vulnerable pawn structure and preparing to contest the central files. Unleashing the pawn breaks the tension, opening a path for the knight to potentially become active. Unleashing a pawn chain now offers queenside space, but exposes your king to the knight's influence. Activating the monarch towards the pawn battleground, aiming to rally support for his vulnerable queenside soldiers. The king ventures out, seeking activation and perhaps finding a weakness on the kingside or disrupting black's pawns. Chasing the king to the open files is a bold, but potentially risky, maneuver as it exposes your own monarch. Initiating pawn expansion on the queenside aims to create a passed pawn and destabilize black's defensive structure. Exposing the king to the rook on the d-file now is risky, inviting a swift counterattack across the board. Pushing the pawn opens a pathway for the queen's knight to potentially infiltrate black's weakened queenside. Reclaiming the central outpost and preparing to pressure white's isolated pawn. Aggressive pawn thrust opens the path for the rook's infiltration. Abandoning the safety of the pawn chain, the king ventures into a perilous exposed position. Advance the knight to a superior square, threatening the pawn and initiating a decisive attack. Creating a passed pawn with this advance may seem tempting, but it exposes your monarch to immediate danger. Reinforcing the knight's outpost solidifies white's central pawn advances. The black king, a magnet for complications, now ventures into a perilous dance with white's knights. Asserting control over the central dark squares, the knight aims to disrupt black's pawn advances and pressure weak points. This knight repositions to control key central squares and potentially disrupt white's pawn majority. Activating the knight to control key squares offers significant attacking potential. Pushing the pawn creates a vital avenue for the knight, aiming to disrupt white's passed pawn. The king is exposed in the center. This check exploits that vulnerability, forcing a difficult decision.